All right, thanks, Brittany. Meanwhile, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is revising its guidance on reopening schools after President Donald Trump tweeted his disagreement with them, saying the CDC's guidelines were too tough and too expensive. Joining us now live is Maria Ferguson. She is the executive director of the Center on Education Policy at George Washington University. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you for having me.
Earlier today, the president tweeted that he would withhold federal funding for schools, which if they did not fully reopen, he would hold that money back, despite the fact that we know most school funding comes from states and local municipalities. But what reopening guidelines is the federal government providing for safe reopening?
They haven't been providing much. As you know, in this country, education is primarily a state responsibility. We have a federalized system of education, so state by state, the decision making happens, and even in some cases, district by district. So they've really been left to fend for themselves. I mean, the CDC has certainly provided guidance. We know how that went. So having listened to your segment just before, Mr. Ingram's sentiments, I think, are sentiments that are being felt across the country right now. There are just not a lot of answers, and the problems are great and getting greater by the day.
What happens if the schools reopen too soon and you have a lot of people getting sick, children getting sick, teachers perhaps, other staff? What happens then?
Well, nobody knows. I mean, to a certain extent, this is uncharted territory. We've sort of been through it once, but having students go back and then having to pull back again, I think, is something that everyone worries about. Not just K through 12, but also in higher ed. We're going to have, hundreds of thousands of college students probably going back to their campuses in the fall as well, and there's the same concern there. So I think there is a real pressure on school leaders to get it right the first time. But getting it right is the amount of logistical planning that's going to be required, and the expense that is going to be required is well beyond what anyone has right now at their disposal.
And also, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos said during a conference call with the governors, she said that ultimately it's not a matter of if schools need to open, it's a matter of how schools must reopen. They must be fully operational. Partial reopening and any combination of in-person and online education is unacceptable. Does that seem rather harsh? Does that seem like it's putting teachers and students at high risk?
Yes, it's harsh, and it's shaming, which is not going to do anyone any good right now. Secretary DeVos doesn't have the authority to make that statement anyway. But what school leaders and state leaders really need right now from national leaders is support, is understanding, and is leadership. And they're not getting any of it right now. So I think most state leaders feel like they're in it alone. Perhaps they're sharing resources and information with one another in a place. I live in Washington, D.C., very close to 3 states, Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. And on this and on a lot of issues, those 3 states have been working together to try and, share knowledge, share experience, share resources where it's possible. But this is really one of those situations where I think states and school districts feel like they are on their own. And sort of shaming at the national level is just the least productive thing we can have right now. This is monumental what schools are facing. They've never faced anything like this before, and that's the last thing they need right now.
Are there any models anywhere in the country or around the world where there has been successful reopening that could possibly work with the system here? President Donald Trump was tweeting about Denmark and Sweden, pointing to those education systems. Is there anything here that you see that could work?
Well, I mean, if you look it's very difficult to compare the United States to any other country, even though many people do all the time. We are unique in the fact that our education system is federalized, meaning we have no national system of education. The U.S. is really the only industrialized country that has that kind of system of education. So doing anything the same anywhere is impossible. It just doesn't happen within our system. So pointing to those countries who, quite frankly, at a national level took very strategic steps towards containing the virus and flattening the curve, steps that our country did not take, It's very difficult to compare the two. It's the ultimate apples and oranges comparison in terms of how they approached and managed the pandemic itself, but also about the school systems that they're dealing with. So it's really not an apt comparison, but what can happen is perhaps there are some best practices that are being learned that we can learn from other countries. So when we get to a point where we can safely reopen our schools, maybe there are certain pieces of PPE that have been particularly effective. We can look to those countries to see if we can pick out examples of things they're doing that would work for us. But we sort of have to get up to their place before we can do that. We are nowhere near where they are right now in this country.
All right, that's been very insightful. Thank you so much for your time, Maria Ferguson, Executive Director of the Center on Education Policy at George Washington University. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Have a good night.
You too. Still to come on BNC Prime, we'll revisit new hurricane predictions coming from Colorado State University. That's right after the break. Stay with us. This is BNC Prime.